Alright, hello and welcome back to Let's Play yet another no-name MAME game. Today's no-name MAME game is, of course, Space Invaders DX. That's right, we've been playing a whole bunch of 80s shoot-em-ups, and every time I'm tempted to compare them to Space Invaders. So you know what? Let's just actually play Space Invaders. This is Space Invaders DX, which is, better than Space Invaders, and you'll soon see why. But first, let's enjoy this little ode to Space Invaders' long, tenuous history. This was released in, like, what, the 90s? And Space Invaders was, like, maybe 20 years old? And you've got the giant guy with the arm. It's like, I have not seen that in any real Space Invaders cabinet. I've not seen that art anywhere other than, like, here. So you've got three modes. You've got sort of like a recapturing of the original Space Invaders. You have a neat little versus mode that's actually kind of a cool little verse shoot 'em up. And previously I thought Twinkle Star Sprites was the only kind of verse puzzle shoot 'em up. There was also like some sort of air bomber or something. Well, there's also Space Invaders DX Verse. And I mean, Space Invaders is a little bit basic, and the verse mode itself is also a little bit basic, but I mean, it's nice. Well, what I mean by basic is, like, Space Invaders is really kind of a skill game, so when you play this verse game, it's pretty much skill versus skill. So if you're playing on someone who's a little bit worse at Space Invaders, they're gonna always lose, and it's gonna be a little bit disappointing for them. So keep that in mind whenever you try to rope, like, a random family member into playing. And then we've also got cute version of Space Invaders, which, if I remember correctly, is the same game, just everything's a little bit cuter. So let's start out with the original game. You can even choose which version you want to play. So you can start out with like the original Space Invaders game and various permutations thereof. So let's show off this one. If you might recall from the intro, there was this one. And so this was really like what the original Space Invaders looked like. I'm actually really impressed, because I'm always used to Space Invaders where it's just Space Invaders with like the black backgrounds. And that's nice, but it's not really visually impressive. But it's like you see this, especially in the 70s, well, okay, late 70s, which is basically the 80s for all intents and purposes, then you'd be pretty impressed, because it's like, graphics this good, you wouldn't even have, well, okay, obviously I realize that in an 80s cabinet, this would be sort of like a backdrop added in, and it wouldn't really be displayed on screen, but even still, having like a colored backdrop this colored would be quite the thing, because it's like even, well, until the 90s you couldn't get a game to display something like this. I say 90s because that's when this game was made. So I find that my strategy in Space Invaders just be like kind of more or less hide behind the shields and pop out to shoot one every now and then. It's a nice little strategy just because then you really avoid getting hit. It's maybe a little bit slow and maybe a little bit methodical, but I mean, Space Invaders is a hard game. You have to really know how to play. Also, too, if you just kind of stand in one place and shoot, tempting though it may be, you're eventually going to get hit and your gaming fun will be over, so you really kind of want to be a bit more cognizant of your strategy, I suppose. Once you get down to like this, where your shields are kind of a ravaged wasteland, and all you've got are a couple guys down. Actually, I found it like really intense that the Space Invaders sometimes like stop moving if like your shot would hit them. Oh gosh, if they would like run into your shot by continually moving, then they intelligently anticipate it and then don't run into your shot like a blind fool. I've always found that to be like a surprisingly neat touch, because I always imagine it's like the 70s games. It's like, of course they'd be programmed as simply as possible so the Space Invaders would just keep moving and no matter what. But no, there was a fair bit of thought going into it. Of course, it kind of reminds me of like Pac-Man, where it's like apparently all the ghosts have their own unique little patterns, which, although maybe programmistically simple, like just the fact that you would even give them different patterns is still kind of cool. So that's what the first version of Space Invaders looked like. And all of these are largely variations of the same thing, so we'll just go straight to this one, which I guess this is arguably the best looking Space Invaders. This is the Space Invaders I'm most familiar with. Actually, I used to play Space Invaders on a VG Pocket Caplet, which is a small little handheld device. And we're talking like kind of a cheap, borderline clone system, although it did have 3 licensed games on it: Burger Time, Space Invaders, and Bust a Move. So I played Space Invaders on it, and it did look like this. And actually, that thing had like a really crisp screen. I mean, for playing Space Invaders on a tiny little handheld, if you can get past the D-pad, I would not recommend anything other to play Space Invaders on a handheld. And plus, too, it was like straight up arcade version. It wasn't like the Game Boy Advance port where you have to worry about the modern game. Oh gosh, the Game Boy Advance game. I think it's based off of like sort of a newer Space Invaders that was making the rounds around then. And I had that for N64, and well, it probably cost as much as a regular release, but it was not really worth a regular release. Although it did have a neat little co-op mode, and I played through that with a friend, and that's actually kind of cool. It gets a little tedious after a while because the action is still sort of the same, but it's a neat little thing to check out. And, I mean, too, how often can you say you played Space Invaders co-op mode? Then there was also the amazing Space Invaders Extreme, and Space Invaders Extreme 2, neither of which would be complete without the Taito paddle controller. I am, of course, ignoring the PSP version, because, hey, no paddle controller, no deal. No dice. You know, I swear on the previous one we played, the aliens would be moving a bit faster by now. So maybe the different arcade revisions actually were kind of different. Or maybe I just warmed up. One or the other. So Space Invaders largely progresses the same. We'll see how long it takes for them to kill me. If I just stand here, open my arms, and give myself up willingly. Not that long, but it took long enough. So now let's try cute Space 'em Up. I can't really show this without a second person, but rest assured, very skill-based, very kind of tit-for-tat sort of gameplay. You're best playing against a space, either a Space Invaders veteran like yourself, or someone at roughly equivalent skill level for maximum fun. So now we're playing as the little bird from New Zealand Adventure, or New Zealand Story, I believe. And we're cuting him up, basically. It's a little this mode is a little disappointing in that it's like basically, or it's actually just Space Invaders with a different skin. But at the same time, I mean, it's still kind of cool. And, I mean, the different skin really does kind of make it cool enough to try and just play through and then see if you can see all of the... Well, okay. We've added in a background, so now you can kind of see... Now you have an incentive to play through the whole game and see all the backgrounds. Which, yeah, seems kind of cool enough. Actually, one neat thing about the, like, this whole game, well, okay, and the verses in particular, is that, like, the verses, well, okay, this is, like, a 90s game, but it plays in relatively old versions of MAME, I think. So, you can, like, play this on essentially anything, and play versus Space Invaders, which is actually pretty hardcore. I mean, I'm not saying it's as good as Twinkle Star Sprites, but, well, okay, it's not quite as good overall as game as Twinkle Star Sprites, but it is very much more of a test of skills, so you can kind of, like, play against your friends. I mean, some disadvantages about playing a skill game with your friends is that, like, eventually your friends will you and your friends will figure out who's the best at the game, and if they continually dominate and no one can get any better, then, yeah, because, I mean, eventually everyone really reaches sort of a plateau where it's like, they're about as good as they're gonna be. So, there's not really much doing about anything. That, it's a little disappointing, and everything changes. I mean, your main character, the backgrounds, the enemies, that's actually a really neat touch. And I am glad that, like, if they were gonna make, like, a cute-em-up version of Space Invaders, then, they really went the whole 9 yards with it. And actually, it's a really cool, like, it's a clever sort of strategy, because adding in like so many things on this compilation, so to speak, just because like you see the original Space Invaders, like, well, I gotta try that, and then you see the other ones, like, well, what are those like? And you see versus Space Invaders, and you pull over your friend, and you're like, hey, check this out, and then you check out the cute 'em up version, and you're like, oh, I wonder what this is like, and then you probably play the cute 'em up version again just so you can see even more backdrops. And then, all of a sudden, they've already gotten, like, 4 quarters out of you, whereas, like, some arcade games, you're just like, oh, one play, that's that. I'm good with this. Oh, Space Invaders. It's kind of a surprisingly hard game. I believe I already showed, like, Space Invaders 1990-something or whatever, which was more of a remix of Space Invaders rather than a straight port. Well, we'll show what this looks like. Oh, God, with the bar lines of color. I'd imagine this would manifest itself as sort of an overlay, but... Oh. Okay, I'm pretty sure the MAME is not quite showing it correctly. And so it's a bit more obnoxious than it is in real life. I'd imagine it implements itself in real life as sort of a classy little overlay. Although I can't even see the player characters, so that's very disconcerting. But I'm assuming it would manifest itself as a nice overlay that would be very pleasing to the eyes. Not a big problem. Otherwise, Space Invaders DX, I mean, I would say this is like arguably the definitive version of arcade Space Invaders for me. Now, I'm not entirely sure if they have like any other things, because I only stumbled upon this by random chance. And even then, there could be something else out there, even more Space Invaders waiting to be seen. But if there isn't, then this is definitely a solid little choice, and it makes us a nice way to re-experience Space Invaders if you can't quite go the whole 9 yards of like dealing with a game that has graphics very reminiscent of the 70s. Well, on that note, this cat's got a scat.